On the morning of January 15th, 1947, a woman walking with her young daughter through a vacant lot in Los Angeles noticed what she first assumed was a discarded store mannequin lying in the weeds a short distance away. When she got closer, she realized, with a horror that would stay with her for the rest of her life, that it wasn't a mannequin at all. It was the body of a young woman, severed cleanly in half at the waist, drained of blood, and posed with a deliberate, almost theatrical precision that suggested whoever had done this wanted the body to be found exactly the way it was. The victim would soon be identified as Elizabeth Short, a 22-year-old aspiring actress the press would nickname the Black Dahlia. Nearly 80 years later, despite one of the largest police investigations in Los Angeles history, her murder has never been solved. Elizabeth Short was born in Massachusetts in 1924, the third of 5 daughters in a family that, like many during the Great Depression, struggled financially through much of her childhood. Her father, a struggling businessman, faked his own death by abandoning the family car near a bridge in 1930, leading everyone to believe he had died by suicide, only to resurface years later, alive and living under his own name in California, having simply walked away from his wife and daughters entirely. Short's mother raised the children largely on her own during this period, and Elizabeth grew up in modest circumstances, developing, according to those who knew her, a persistent fascination with Hollywood and the glamorous lives of film stars she read about and watched in movie theaters throughout her adolescence. As a teenager, Short suffered from chronic bronchial and asthma-related health problems, severe enough that she spent portions of several winters in Florida, where the warmer climate was thought to ease her symptoms, staying with family friends while the rest of her family remained in Massachusetts. It was during these periods away from home that she began developing the independent, itinerant pattern of living that would come to define much of her adult life. Moving between different cities and different living situations, often relying on the generosity or hospitality of new acquaintances rather than any stable, long-term home base. By her late teens, Short had reconnected, at least briefly, with her father, who was by then living in California, and she moved out to join him for a period in the early 1940s, hoping the move might bring her closer to the Hollywood career she'd dreamed about since childhood. That arrangement, however, proved short-lived and difficult, and Short soon moved out on her own, beginning a pattern that would continue for the remainder of her life. Taking various jobs, staying with different friends, acquaintances, and romantic partners for weeks or months at a time, and pursuing modeling and acting opportunities that, despite her evident interest in her striking appearance, never developed into any substantial or lasting career. During the mid-1940s, Short spent time in Florida again, where she met and briefly became engaged to a U.S. Army Air Forces officer, a relationship that ended when the man was killed in a plane crash in 1945, a loss that friends and family later described as having affected her deeply. In the months and years that followed, Short continued her pattern of frequent relocation, moving between California and various other states, forming and dissolving relationships with a wide range of men, many of them connected to the military, to Hollywood's fringes, or simply to the loose social networks of nightclubs and bars she frequented in whatever city she happened to be living in at the time. By late 1946, Short had settled, at least temporarily, in Los Angeles, staying in a series of short-term arrangements with various acquaintances and, at different points, with men she was casually dating. Friends and roommates from this period described her, with some consistency, as friendly, striking in appearance, prone to embellishing details about her own life and background, and somewhat evasive or private about the specifics of where exactly she was staying or who she was involved with at any given time. A pattern that would later make reconstructing her final days considerably more difficult for investigators than it might otherwise have been. The last confirmed sighting of Elizabeth Short alive placed her in downtown Los Angeles on the evening of January 9th, 1947, roughly 6 days before her body was discovered. According to the timeline investigators eventually pieced together, Short had spent time with a man in San Diego in the days prior, before traveling back to Los Angeles, where she was seen at the Biltmore Hotel, apparently waiting to meet someone, before leaving the hotel lobby and effectively vanishing from any confirmed, verified sighting for the following several days. A gap in her timeline that has never been fully or definitively accounted for despite decades of subsequent investigation. When her body was discovered on the morning of January 15th, in a vacant lot in the Limer Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. The scene that greeted investigators was almost immediately recognized as unlike anything most of the responding detectives had encountered before. Short's body had been severed completely at the waist, with the two halves positioned several inches apart, arranged deliberately rather than simply discarded. Her body had been drained almost entirely of blood, and the surrounding grass showed no significant blood pooling, indicating strongly that she had not been killed at the location where she was found, but had instead been murdered elsewhere and then transported to the vacant lot specifically to be displayed in this manner. The autopsy, conducted in the days following the discovery, revealed the full extent of the injuries inflicted on Short before her death. Injuries so severe and so deliberately inflicted that they left little doubt investigators were dealing with an unusually methodical and disturbed individual. The medical examiner determined that Short had been subjected to extensive torture prior to her death, including numerous lacerations across her body, and that her face had been cut in a manner that left a deep, extended wound stretching from each corner of her mouth toward her ears, an injury that would become one of the case's most infamous and disturbing details, and one that true crime researchers and forensic experts have continued discussing and analyzing in the decades since. The official cause of death was determined to be hemorrhage and shock resulting from the extensive facial lacerations, combined with a blow to the head, indicating that Short had likely still been alive for at least some portion of the torture inflicted upon her, a detail the coroner's report made clear despite its deeply disturbing implications. The precision of the bisection itself became a significant early focus of the investigation, with detectives and medical examiners debating whether the method used suggested a killer with specific medical, surgical, or anatomical training, given how cleanly and deliberately the body had reportedly been divided. This detail fueled early theories that the killer might be a doctor, surgeon, medical student, or someone with comparable anatomical knowledge and access to surgical instruments, though later analysis and expert opinion has remained divided on whether the bisection genuinely required specialized medical skill, or whether it could plausibly have been accomplished by someone with more general knowledge of anatomy and access to sufficiently sharp tools without necessarily requiring formal medical training. Once Short's identity was confirmed through fingerprint records on file from a prior minor arrest, and once newspapers began covering the case, the story exploded into one of the most sensationalized crime narratives Los Angeles had ever seen. The press, drawing on both the striking, theatrical nature of the crime scene and Short's habit, noted by acquaintances, of frequently wearing black clothing, began referring to her using the nickname that would eventually eclipse her actual name in public memory, the Black Dahlia, a moniker that some accounts trace to a contemporary film titled The Blue Dahlia that had been playing in theaters around the same period, though the exact origin of the specific nickname has been debated by researchers ever since. Media coverage of the case, driven by intense competition between Los Angeles's several competing newspapers at the time, quickly became extraordinarily aggressive, with reporters in some documented instances reaching potential witnesses, and even Short's own mother before police investigators managed to do so themselves, occasionally obtaining information directly relevant to the investigation and publishing it before detectives had the opportunity to verify or properly utilize it. This intense, competitive media environment, while generating enormous public interest and cooperation in some respects, also significantly complicated the official investigation, contaminating potential leads, generating false confessions from individuals seeking attention, and creating an atmosphere in which separating credible information from sensationalized speculation became increasingly difficult almost from the earliest days of the case. The Los Angeles Police Department, facing intense public and media pressure, assigned a substantial number of detectives to the case and pursued an extraordinarily wide range of investigative leads over the following months and years. Investigators worked to reconstruct Short's final days and movements as thoroughly as possible, interviewing dozens of men she was known to have dated, socialized with, or briefly lived alongside during her time in Los Angeles, given her documented pattern of frequent, often short-lived relationships and living arrangements. Approximately 10 days after the murder, a letter was mailed to a Los Angeles newspaper, purportedly from the killer, containing several of Short's personal items, including identification cards, an address book, and other belongings that had been missing since her death, along with a note constructed from letters cut out of newspaper print, spelling out a message indicating the sender intended to turn himself in soon, a promise that, notably, was never actually fulfilled. Investigators worked to determine whether this letter, and several subsequent communications received in the following weeks claiming to be from the killer, were genuine, though the sheer volume of copycat and attention-seeking correspondence the case generated made definitively authenticating any specific communication extremely difficult, and no communication ever led investigators to a confirmed suspect. Over the decades that followed the murder, an extraordinarily large number of individuals either confessed directly to the crime or were named by others, including family members, acquaintances, and independent researchers, as likely suspects, a pattern that has made the Black Dahlia case one of the most heavily theorized unsolved murders in American history. Los Angeles police at the time reportedly investigated dozens of confessions, virtually all of which were eventually determined to be false, offered by individuals for reasons ranging from a desire for notoriety to genuine psychological disturbance unrelated to any actual involvement in the crime. Among the more persistently discussed named suspects over the years was Dr. George Hodel, a Los Angeles physician whose own son, a retired police detective, later conducted an extensive independent investigation into his deceased father decades after the murder, ultimately publishing a book arguing he believed his father was responsible not only for Short's murder, but potentially for several other unsolved killings in the Los Angeles area during roughly the same period. This theory drew on a combination of circumstantial evidence, including Hodel's documented medical background and surgical knowledge, wiretap recordings from an unrelated 1949 police investigation into Hodel connected to different allegations, and photographs and personal items found among his father's belongings that his son argued suggested a connection to Short. While this theory has drawn significant attention and remains one of the most extensively developed suspect theories in the case's history, it has never been definitively proven, and official law enforcement agencies have not formally confirmed Hodel, or any other specific individual, as Short's killer. Other frequently discussed suspects and theories over the decades have included various men from Short's documented circle of acquaintances and romantic partners in Los Angeles, along with a range of individuals connected more loosely, or in some cases entirely speculatively, to the crime through independent research, amateur investigation, and continued media coverage that has never fully abetted in the decades since the murder. Despite this extraordinarily wide range of theories and named suspects, no individual has ever been formally charged with Short's murder, and the case remains, in official Los Angeles Police Department records, unsolved to this day. Part of what has made the case so difficult to resolve, even with the benefit of decades of subsequent forensic and investigative advancement, is the combination of significant evidence contamination during the original 1947 investigation, driven substantially by the aggressive and competitive media environment surrounding the case, along with the simple passage of time, which has meant that most individuals who might have had direct, first-hand knowledge relevant to the murder have long since died, taking whatever information they possess permanently with them. Physical evidence from the original crime scene and investigation, by modern forensic standards, was also far more limited and less rigorously preserved than would be expected in a comparable case investigated today, further complicating any effort to apply modern forensic techniques, including DNA analysis, to definitively resolve lingering questions about the killer's identity. The Black Dahlia case has, in the decades since Short's murder, become deeply embedded in the broader cultural mythology of Los Angeles itself, frequently cited as one of the defining unsolved crimes of the city's mid-20th century history, alongside its examination in numerous books, films, documentaries, and works of fiction that have drawn on the case's stark, disturbing details and its unresolved nature to construct narratives ranging from straightforward journalistic investigation to heavily fictionalized crime drama. This sustained cultural attention has, in turn, generated an unusually large and active community of amateur researchers and independent investigators who have continued examining the case's evidence, theories, and named suspects for decades, occasionally surfacing new leads or historical documents, though none of this continued attention has yet produced a conclusively accepted resolution. Elizabeth Short's own family, and particularly her mother, endured the case's intense and sustained public attention for years following the murder, a burden made considerably heavier by the sensationalized, often exploitative nature of much of the press coverage the case generated from its earliest days. Coverage that frequently focused more on constructing a lurid, mysterious narrative around Short's death than on treating her, first and foremost, as a young woman whose life had been taken through an act of extreme and deliberate violence. In the years since, some more recent examinations of the case have made a deliberate effort to reframe the narrative around Short herself, emphasizing her documented personal history, her relationships, and her own aspirations, rather than exclusively centering the case around the disturbing details of her death or the decades of speculation surrounding her killer's identity. Nearly 80 years after Elizabeth Short's body was discovered in that Limer Park vacant lot, the case remains formally unsolved, its investigative file still technically open within the Los Angeles Police Department, even as the practical likelihood of ever reaching a definitive, universally accepted resolution continues to diminish with each passing year. What remains, in the absence of that resolution, is a case that has come to occupy an unusual and enduring place in American criminal history, extensively investigated and extensively theorized about, discussed and dissected across nearly 8 decades of continued public fascination, and yet, at its core, still defined by the same fundamental, unanswered question that confronted detectives standing in that vacant lot on the morning of January 15, 1947. Who did this, and why?